last video, I talked about exploring the fifth dimension through the concept and idea of motion itself and time, and what the possible structures of motion might be, in that there are three types of motions. There is a linear motion, there is a causal motion, and that there is a chaotic motion, or that all these three elements, linear or momentum, causal or agency, and chaotic or probability, might constitute the actual structure of motion itself in order to try to understand what motion is, instead of just using a simple word such as something that moves or acts, and that there is a process between the three. Now, before I go from the fourth, fifth, and sixth dimension into the next possible three dimensions of 7, 8, and 9, I would like to clarify something about how these types of motions are in the practical reality of participating with the world through our own volition and our own soul and our own spirit, and that these three elements of our own selves, the soul, the spirit, and our volition and our sentience, is actually a relationship of space and object and the relation between the two. And each of these three elements of space, object, and their relation, or medium, if one prefers, can have its own activity and its own passivity and its in different objects. So in order to clarify that, basically, even though space comes in three dimensions and three elements, space in the spiritual sense and in the real sense, that each of those elements can have a different function at different times. And I find that to help understand this, it's helpful to visualize the self, or our relationship to space, infinite space at large, and the infinitely small point that would be us, our participation with it, right? Our volition. That the infinitely large space is our soul, is that sentient, that space is the sensorium of the self. That the infinitely small point is our volition, it's our will, it's our agency. And that the relation between space and the self, right, so infinity at large and the infinitely small point, has a relationship, and that relationship is has probability, a probabilistic nature to it, a chaotic nature, that sometimes all the time, our intentions are not exactly what we want them to be, although that also necessarily doesn't have to be the case. And that each of these three elements can, at different moments, have a different function, depending how it relates to the other two, right? It's not just a one-dimensional or two-directional relationship, in a sense where it's just the point, the infinitely small relating to the infinitely large. The infinitely small can relate to also the relational part, the medium, to the chaos, to the probability. The infinitely large space can also relate to the medium or the relational part, to probability or chaos. And so too, the probability chaos can also relate to our infinitesimal selves, right, the small point, which is our volition, and can also relate to the infinitely large. And so this creates a very interesting dynamic, which which can be creative in itself once it's understood. So in order to help understand this, I find it helpful to visualize the self, or the self in space, as a sphere with a point in the middle of it. And the sphere, being the circumference, and the point being the center, would have a radius as a relationship to it. So a line that would be drawn from the point or the circumference to the point. So the relational part would be the radius, the volitional part would be the infinitely small point at the center of the sphere, and the space, the infinity of space, or what is conventionally known as empty space, would be the circumference. Now, of course, this is an analogy or a symbolic representation, but it is helpful because it is the shape that is closest to what it would actually be. Where in better actuality, it would be the just infinity on infinity throughout infinity, but that lacks a shape. And then once we do give it shape, as I did in one of my other videos, or I tried to anyway, I know that it is confusing at sometimes to piece together my ramblings, but once the pieces of infinity start to take function, or put it differently, once functions are given to different parts of infinity, which it is possible to do, there's a differentiation in each of these functions so that it actually does give shape to infinity, and that shape is closest resembling a sphere with a point in the middle and a radius. And so traditionally, or one of the most intuitive approaches to understanding the volitional function of the self, right, this infinitely small point, is that this volitional function, when it is active, that it actually is active because of the absolute nature of space, and so that space is actually what is permitting the ability for an infinitely small point to become active. So in a way, when the volition is active, let's say onto itself, so it is actually revealing itself to itself, it is awakening or becoming enlightened to itself. It is actually all of infinity which is funneling itself through that point. So it would be the circumference funneling itself through the radius to the point. And so in a way, when volition or agency or your self-causality or whatever one wants to call it, the spirit, is active onto itself, then that would be the shape that could be represented through its other two elements, right? So the infinitely small point that is being related to by the circumference and the radius. So that would be the most intuitive approach to the activity of the self, because when the self is not active, so when the point is passive, and this is what I was talking about before, that the different parts of this sphere and point and radius, the different parts of it can become passive at different moments. When the volition is passive, there's an opening up, right? So it's not about pulling towards the point anymore, but it's about opening up, and then thus the space around you is actually realize that it is your sensorium. It is what allows you to experience the quality of sensation. It is the sentient quality of the self, and this passivity, and it is passive because it allows the self to experience something other than its single point. So you're able, as a passive opening or opening yourself up to not interrupt the experience of something other than yourself. And so in this case, what becomes active is actually the radius, right? You're no longer just experiencing the point, but you're experiencing something more than yourself, and you're experiencing the radius in this case. When the circumference becomes passive and the point becomes passive as well, and then the radius takes on activity of the self, then something very interesting happens. And what happens here is that the chaos and the project, because so the volition is something that projects itself. What I was talking about before about the volition being in the center point is, so it's an activity which projects itself to itself. But when that becomes passive, and therefore also the circumference becomes passive, but the radius takes on its activity, then what happens is that the projection of the self is no longer towards the center point. It's no longer about the volition, but it projects itself at both, or alternatively, between its circumference and its center, creating a probability or a chaos within itself. Because the object and the probability, so an object and probability are somewhat diametrically opposed, as you either have an object or you don't. But in probability, you have the possibility of an object or a possibility of differentiation of something happening. And so when the radius takes on activity, the activity and the passivity alternates between points in space, so things in space, and its circumference, which is the largest self, right? So the largest self is what we'll call the soul. It is the destination of the soul. It is also the source of the spirit. So it is, in a way, two things. It is, in the passive sense, it is the destination of the soul, meaning that it's the inevitable return to the largest part of oneself. In the active sense, it is the source of one's own creation during time. And so when the radius takes on activity, and during that activity, let's say the volitional infinitesimal point of the self, so the self becomes passive, but the radius is active, it will make things appear. It will, in a way, manifest through its probability of objects, appear in the experience of the self, in the sentient experience of one's life, of one's existence, and what manifests is actually, if the circumference is passive, it will manifest the road back to oneself, or the greater self, or one of the greater selves. If the circumference is active while the radius is also active. And I'll translate this more into intuitive practical terms in just a moment. But when the circumference is active, then it would manifest things of your own creation that you've asked for, right? So in everyday life, sometimes we say, well, I wish there was more meaning to, or if there was meaning to existence, and wish that there was something inherently valued in existence. And so, not to say that I take the word meaning in an absolute sense, that because there is a duality, right? There is what is inherent in the cosmos, and there is what we create. And so what is inherent is the road back to revealing your greater self, your greater power, or your greater nature, your relationship with the rest of the cosmos, and so on. And so the radius is therefore the capacity to reveal one's own soul to oneself. But also what can happen is, so either looking for the meaning, the inherent meaning into existence of oneself, or creating a path, or creating an experience, or creating a possibility from oneself, so the circumference is active, creating new points of manifestation in your experience of yourself, your experience of the world. Now this is of course very abstract, and so I have to realize that there are many selves in existence in the cosmos, and that there is also a whole momentum of created objects in this world that interact with one's own activity and passivity. And so that creates a whole other chaotic and probability field, and the probability of one being active and the probability of one being passive. So there is always some part of us that is active. When we are fully at rest, in the most Buddhist sense of being Zen, the activity tends to be in the circumference. Right, so we have this blithe awareness of the world around us, but inside it's just passive and just experiencing or being sentiently aware of existence itself, and that it is. And so the Buddhist position, or the Zen position, is very much deeply rooted into the infinite and the eternal, or sort of trying to be. And some succeed very well, and so the experience is very secure in the self, in that quality of the infinite and the eternal, which is space. Space is both the infinite and the eternal. And space is traditionally seen or intuitively experienced in normal circumstances in the context of terra firma as being empty, and thus the whole notion of no thought in Zen or Buddhism or Taoism, that the activity of the self be very simple, if any, and oscillating between activity and passivity. Alright, so in the everyday, in a more practical, intuitive approach to the activity of the self as a volitional point, and the activity of the circumference and the radius. So what would be the radius, therefore, in a more intuitive approach? So the radius, in order to help understand this, is the relationship between infinity, yourself, and objects in it, right? So this is different to just relating to infinite space, or letting infinite space just relate to you. Right, so this would be, and it doesn't have to be objects which are actually existing, but it's probably easiest to think about it with objects that are at first that are actually existing. Is that the question, or the approach that can have with objects, is that when you're looking at an object, you could ask yourself, well, what is that object's meaning to me, right? Or what is the actual relationship with an object in that moment in time? And for instance, as if you were to dream, if you were in a dream and you would be dreaming about a tree, that you would be walking by a tree, the dream, this tree actually has a significance. It could be random, like completely random, or seem to be random, but actually that tree is coming from somewhere when it is coming from within you, right? And so that tree does have meaning, and therefore is part of the greater psychological structure that is happening, and that you're experiencing. So the tree is surfacing to your consciousness in the dream, and it is coming from somewhere. So you can ask the question, well, what is my relationship to this tree, and what does this tree mean when you're dreaming about it? Now, in the waking world, or in the physical body world, if you were to walk in a park, you see a whole bunch of trees, and you can pick one out. And so the question might not be exactly the same, because this tree is not coming only from your psychological structure, but it is it is something that has had its own history and its own evolution, that that a tree spawned at this place at a given moment in time. If it is out in the wild nature, it's spawned through the probability process of it's a tree succeeding to have grown there. If it is a park, well, it was planted probably by somebody. However, what one can do is ask, well, what is my relationship to that tree at this very moment in time? What did I think about right before the tree? And what was my relationship to what I thought right before? And now that I'm looking at the tree, what is my relationship, right? Because the radius is looking at the relationship between the self and the greater self, right? The infinitely small self and the infinitely large self. And by asking the question, what is my relationship to that tree at this very moment in time, what will happen is there'll be an oscillation between of whether the self will be active or passive, or whether the greater self, so whether the volitional self will be active or passive. And by asking the question, it is becoming active and sort of passive at the same time, because the question is also an opening. But the greater self, the circumference, is also active and passive, that it was going to respond. And so the asking oneself the question, what is my relationship to this tree right now? The answers that will come after, if that question is asked with enough sincerity and honesty, the answers might manifest in very interesting ways. They might manifest in a synchronicity of ways, or it might even manifest in, well, magical ways. You could even ask yourself the question, what could be my relationship with that object, with that tree, for instance, or that bird, or that particular cloud, or that person, right? What could be? So, or even asking not even asking questions, but making simple statements, and basically creating novelty. Because there is an infinite amount of radiuses that can relate to the point, and from the point to the infinite large itself. There's an infinite amount of radiuses, right? So there are an infinite amount of ways to interact with any given object. Now, of course, you can do the same thing with yourself. Well, what is my... so if you're taking yourself as the object, and the infinity at large as the object at the same time, if one were to have the presence of mind to do that at that moment, then you're kind of taking like the whole world of your own self and asking, well, making statements or asking questions. But usually when you ask questions, the answers will follow. And if you make statements, you also create something, but then being able to recognize what happens after, if there is enough intensity or sincerity and/or insincerity, then basically having the radius, the relationship with with objects or with the self, from that point of view between the infinitely small and the infinitely large, creates, when the radius is active, then it creates a whole much more creative approach to opening up the experience of the soul and the spirit, and manifesting truly soulful experiences or spiritual experiences, or just very real experiences where the reality of nature itself will, well, manifest itself.